The lobby buzzed softly with the hum of polite conversation and distant elevator chimes. Marble floors reflected the warm amber lighting, and the scent of fresh lilies lingered in the air. Elena stepped inside first, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Her eyes scanned the opulent hotel interior, but her face remained unreadable, poised, elegant, distant. Behind her, Jason followed, dragging a suitcase in one hand and holding his phone in the other. His eyes wandered, taking in the ornate chandeliers and velvet-lined furniture. He looked every bit the grown man he was becoming, tall, composed, but carrying an edge of restlessness beneath his calm exterior. Richard, Elena's husband, brought up the rear. He was already on a business call, half distracted, gesturing toward the concierge while his voice floated in fragmented sentences about meetings and projections. He barely acknowledged the receptionist as he handed over his ID. Same pattern, Jason muttered quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Elena heard it but didn't respond. Her expression didn't change, though her fingers tightened slightly around her handbag. They were checked into the top-floor executive suite. 2 bedrooms, 1 living area, and a view of the city skyline that promised to be stunning at night. But none of that impressed Elena. She'd seen dozens of luxury hotels, each one a backdrop to a familiar disappointment. As they rode the elevator upward, Richard continued his call, gesturing without speaking to his wife and son. Jason leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the digital numbers climb. Elena stood silently, eyes fixed on her reflection in the mirrored elevator doors. There was something in her face she barely recognized anymore, a weariness not from age, but absence. Once inside the suite, Richard dropped his briefcase and checked his phone. There's a client emergency in San Diego. I'll need to fly out tonight. Elena turned slowly toward him. We just got here. I know. It wasn't planned. I'll be back by tomorrow night, at the latest. Jason glanced between them, sensing the familiar tension. He didn't say anything, but the air between his parents had grown heavy, thick with a silence too old to name. Richard leaned over to peck Elena's cheek, an obligatory gesture more habit than affection. Then, turning to Jason, he gave a brief nod. You'll take care of your mother, right? Jason only replied with a dry, sure. Within the hour, Richard was gone. The room felt larger, quieter. The city lights flickered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Elena remained on the sofa, staring at nothing in particular. Jason stood near the minibar, pulling out a bottle of water. So, it's just us, he said, trying to mask the awkwardness. Elena offered a faint smile. Seems that way. He sat down across from her, stretching his arms along the back of the sofa. You want to do something? Go out? Order room service? Watch a movie? She shook her head gently. I'm fine. Just tired. Jason studied her for a moment. There was something fragile about her tonight, something muted behind her polished demeanor. Her eyes, usually sharp and guarded, seemed dimmer, clouded with something unspoken. You okay? He asked quietly. Elena looked at him then, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. I'm just not used to being seen, she said softly. Jason didn't understand what she meant. Not completely, but the words lingered. Later, she disappeared into the bedroom to shower. He remained in the living room, flipping through channels without watching anything. After a while, he stood and walked toward his own room, passing by hers. Her door was ajar. He paused just for a moment. Inside, the faint sound of water running echoed in the background. A warm light spilled out from the bathroom, casting a soft glow across the room. Her silk robe lay folded on the edge of the bed. He turned away quickly, feeling an unfamiliar discomfort rising in his chest. Back in his room, Jason sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Something had changed. He couldn't name it, but it was there, an invisible shift in the air, a new tension threaded between the silence. In the other room, Elena poured herself a glass of wine and stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the city lights. She exhaled slowly, pressing the glass to her lips. And outside, Rain began to fall. The sound of rain persisted through the night, tapping softly against the glass like a metronome of silence. Jason couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, arms behind his head, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts circled around Elena, how she looked earlier, how she sounded. There was something different in her voice, in the way she spoke, as if she were finally peeling back a layer she'd hidden for years. Eventually, the stillness pulled him from the bed. He stepped into the hallway, drawn by a faint glow spilling from the living room. As he approached, he found Elena sitting on the balcony, wrapped in a shawl, her wine glass nearly empty. The door was slightly ajar, letting in a gentle draft that smelled of rain and wet stone. She didn't turn when he joined her. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, her voice low, almost fragile. Jason shook his head. "Too quiet." Elena let out a faint chuckle. Funny how silence can be louder than words. They sat together, watching the city lights blur in the drizzle. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was comfort in the quiet, a kind of peace that didn't need filling. But beneath it, something stirred, something unresolved. "Did you ever think this is what life would be like?" Jason asked, his tone thoughtful. Elena tilted her head, considering. "Not really. When I was your age, I thought love would be everything. That if you married the right person, the rest would fall into place." "And did it?" "No," she smiled faintly, then glanced at him. "Sometimes love fades quietly. Not with arguments or betrayal, just distance. You wake up one day, and you're strangers in the same room." Jason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That sounds lonely." "It is." The vulnerability in her voice unsettled him. He'd never heard her speak this openly. She wasn't just his mother in that moment, she was a woman. A person with regrets, desires, disappointments. Someone who had once been full of dreams, now muted by routine. "I don't think I've ever really seen you like this," he said honestly. Elena looked at him, eyes soft. "And I don't think I've ever felt seen." Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, the space between them felt smaller, like something intangible had bridged it. Jason shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how close they were, how intimate this conversation had become. "I've been thinking about Kylie," he said, steering the topic away. "I don't think it's working." Elena's brows rose. "Why not?" "She doesn't understand me." "Not really. It feels like we're just going through the motions." Elena nodded slowly. "That's how it starts. You stop talking. Stop listening. And then one day you stop feeling." Jason glanced at her. "How did you and Dad get so far apart?" Her lips pressed together, the question hitting harder than intended. "I wish I knew. Maybe we stopped choosing each other." A gust of wind swept through the balcony, lifting the edge of her shawl. She shivered slightly, drawing it tighter around her shoulders. Without thinking, Jason rose and took the spare blanket draped over the armchair, gently wrapping it around her. Their hands brushed, just briefly, but the touch lingered longer than it should have. "Thank you," she murmured, looking up at him. He sat down again, his heartbeat inexplicably louder in his ears. He hadn't meant anything by it. Not really. But something about the softness of her eyes, the vulnerability etched into her face, it pulled at him in a way he didn't understand. Elena turned her gaze back toward the city, sipping the last of her wine. "You're not like other boys your age," she said softly. Jason glanced at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You notice things. You listen. You care." A long silence followed. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, but loaded with something neither of them could name. The rain grew heavier, drumming louder against the glass. Jason stood up. "I'll make us some tea." Elena smiled faintly, eyes lingering on him as he disappeared into the suite. She exhaled deeply, clutching the blanket tighter. Her skin tingled where his hands had touched her, and she hated how she noticed. In the kitchen, Jason busied himself with the kettle, but his thoughts refused to settle. The warmth in her voice, the look in her eyes, it had stirred something unintended, something dangerous. When he returned with the tea, Elena had already stepped back inside, standing by the window again. He handed her the cup. Their fingers touched again, deliberately this time, or maybe not. Neither of them pulled away too quickly. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, distant yet ominous. Inside, a silence deeper than words settled between them. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through gauzy curtains and softened by the overcast sky. The rain had stopped, but its scent still lingered in the air, clean, cool, and oddly comforting. The hotel suite felt different now. Still, yet weighted. As if the silence had settled deeper into the walls, carrying the memory of words left unspoken. Jason stirred first. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on knees, staring at his hands. Sleep had come late and left early, leaving his mind clouded with fragments of moments he couldn't forget. The blanket he'd draped around his mother still clung to his memory like static electricity, warm, intimate, complicated. He stepped into the hallway and found the living room empty. Elena's bedroom door was shut. He hesitated outside it for a second, then walked past toward the kitchen. The clink of cups and the hum of the kettle filled the silence, but they did little to calm his thoughts. By the time Elena emerged, she was dressed in a soft beige blouse and fitted trousers. Her hair was neatly pinned, her features composed, but her eyes betrayed a trace of unrest. She greeted him with a faint smile, polite, distant, cautious. "Sleep well?" he asked, watching her too closely. She nodded. "Well enough." Jason poured her a cup of tea and slid it across the table. Their fingers didn't touch this time. The space between them, once tender and uncertain, was now laced with restraint. They ate in near silence. The clatter of cutlery and the low hum of city traffic outside were the only interruptions. Jason tried to speak several times, but the words died before reaching his tongue. He wanted to ask her what last night meant, if it meant anything at all. But perhaps silence was safer. After breakfast, they began packing. The hotel stay was over, but a sense of unfinished business clung to the room. Elena folded her clothes slowly, methodically, pausing at her robe as she placed it into her suitcase. She held it briefly, eyes lost in thought, before tucking it away. In Jason's room, his suitcase remained open, half-packed. He moved slowly, distracted. A part of him wanted to stay, wanted more time, not just with her, but with the closeness they had shared. Yet another part wrestled with guilt, with confusion, with the weight of his own intentions. When he returned to the main room, he noticed a folded note resting on his pillow. Not his handwriting. He unfolded it carefully. "Thank you for seeing me, even when I didn't want to be seen."
Mom.
His chest tightened. The words were simple, but they carried a depth that pierced through his confusion. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't permission. But it was acknowledgement of something neither of them could name, yet both had undeniably felt. Elena stood by the window again, her suitcase now zipped and ready. Jason approached quietly, slipping the note into his pocket. "You didn't have to write that," he said softly. "I know," she replied without looking at him. "But I wanted to." The car ride home was uneventful, wrapped in the same hushed energy that had begun to define them. Elena stared out the window most of the way, her fingers tracing idle patterns on her knee. Jason sat beside her, watching the city blur past, wondering if they'd crossed a line, or merely approached it too closely. At home, Richard was already in his office, phone pressed to his ear, laptop open. He barely looked up when they walked in. "Glad you're back," he said without emotion. Jason went straight to his room. Elena lingered for a moment, watching her husband through the doorway, then quietly turned away. She poured herself a glass of wine and returned to the window. The same posture, the same stillness, yet something within her had shifted. Later that evening, Jason texted her. "You okay?" She stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I am now." She didn't send anything more. She didn't need to. Jason stared at her reply, reading it again and again. He didn't know what he'd wanted from her, not entirely. Clarity? Closure? Something else? But maybe, deep down, all he had really wanted was to matter. To be seen by someone who had once seemed so distant, unreachable. And in some strange, delicate way, he had been. In the quiet of the night, Elena stood before the mirror, studying her reflection not for flaws or imperfections, but for the trace of something returning, something forgotten. Not youth, not desire, just presence. And somewhere, beneath the weight of everything unspoken, that was enough.